Heretical Thinking, the Radical Option. Written by David Christopher Lane. Narrated by Mark Shumka. Dedication. I am happy to dedicate this book to my two sons, Sean and Kelly. Chapter 1. How seriously should we take mysticism? The heretical imperative versus a sociable God. According to Peter L. Berger, in his 1979 book, The Heretical Imperative, modern man has three fundamental options in relation to religion. The deductive option, reaffirming a particular religious tradition in spite of counterclaims, arguments against it, for example, Islamic fundamentalism. The reductive option, modernizing a religious tradition in terms which make it sensible or understandable in today's predominant modes of thought, for example, Rudolf Bultmann and the demythologization of the New Testament. Or the inductive option, turning from external forms of authority to individual experience, for example, William James and the varieties of religious experience. Although all three options can be exercised, Berger clearly favors and argues for the merits of the inductive option, since it allows for individuals to choose orientations based upon their own religious encounters. Indeed, the heretical imperative can be seen as Berger's passionate attempt to save the transcendent elements of religion from the ravages of modern consciousness. As Dennis P. McCann notes, undoubtedly the problem of relativism stands at the heart of the heretical imperative. Berger welcomes the pluralism of perspectives resulting from secularization and relativizes the relativizers who would set limits to this pluralism. Since all thought, including modernity itself, is shaped by plausibility structures, no thought has a cognitive privilege with reference to any other thought. Therefore, modernity cannot be used to intimidate religious believers into abandoning their faith. Yet, by emphasizing the superiority of the inductive possibility over the other two options, Berger is unwittingly putting forth his own skewed vision of the religious enterprise. In fact, Berger's stress on individual experience is reflective of modern consciousness, which turns religion more and more into a private act. Thus, Berger cannot escape from resorting to his own special kind of reductionism. Viable religion is essentially individualistic and experiential. Now, there is no problem in posing such an argument, but to call this position inductive, denoting a type of value-free openness, betrays the fact that it is derived from an already held religious purview, which heavily attends toward the mystical, Gnostic Christianity, Advaita Vedanta, esoteric Buddhism, and not the revelatory, biblical Christianity, Orthodox Judaism, Shiite Islam. Hence, Berger's inductive methodology calls into question the exclusive claims of any one religious tradition. As such, only certain forms of religious endeavor can remain intact in the modern age. These forms, according to Berger, are almost always mystical in origin and point to knowledge which is not mythic or rational in basis, but transempirical or otherworldly. However, does the inductive option really do justice to the various expressions of religions? Michael L. Morgan, in his article Judaism and the Heretical Imperative, argues that it does not. The differences between Berger, e.g. the inductive option, and Judaism, then, are not superficial. It is not merely that the heretical imperative is not the Jewish imperative, nor is it merely that the Jewish historical situation is a postmodern situation. It is more than that. For Judaism, no phenomenological sociology can do justice to an experience that is secular and religious, human and divine, all at once. Lurking in the background here is a distinction between fact and value, is and ought, that is troubling, both in the application and in the breach. Jewish thought sees the Jewish experience differently. By arguing against the deductive and reductive options, Berger sets up a limited agenda of what truly constitutes genuine religiosity. In doing so, Berger's inductive purity becomes seriously tainted. Naturally, one cannot help wondering if Bergerian induction is actually more akin to mystical deduction, or if Berger is really a secular reductionist in disguise. Perhaps the more important issue raised by Berger's typology, though, is the relationship between experience and its interpretation. That is, do certain kinds of religious experience lend themselves to particular modes of interpretation? Or are religious encounters flavored by the cultural context in which they arise? But Berger falls short in trying to answer these questions by not making the religious virtuosi, Weber's term for those who have direct perceptions of transpersonal realities, a fundamental component of his inductive methodology. Instead, Berger bases his approach on persons who have had, at best, fugitive and imitational experiences in this area, and whose religious beliefs are grounded in a socially mediated tradition. By not taking into full consideration the insights of the religious virtuosi, Berger limits his experiential option to the verbal arena, and thereby seriously damages the ultimate truth values that his inductive approach can offer. Moreover, Berger does not provide us with any persuasive reasons why transcendental religious encounters are not merely projections or peculiar byproducts of socially disenfranchised individuals. He assumes, in a contradictory move of deduction, that we accept such claims on faith. Comments McCann, "My point is simply that either Berger is kidding himself when he says you do not have to be a religious virtuoso to take the inductive option in theology, or be unaware of the cognitive dissonance created by trying to synthesize the methodological skepticism built into his sociology of knowledge with the methodological naivete prescribed in his phenomenology of religious experience. In either case, any theology based on this sort of induction will be capable of generating only the softest of truth claims." Berger's mistake is that he leaves out one of the most important elements in the mystical encounter, the overwhelming sense of certainty, mysterium tremendum. It is this self-authenticating power of a religious reality which gives mysticism support for its claims of veridicality. To fully appreciate this sense, however, it is necessary that one be a religious virtuoso, or at least has access, momentary or otherwise, to the transcendent. If such a requirement is not made, then Berger's option is not truly inductive, or experiential in nature, predisposed for acceptance of rejection, but is merely a speculative way in which to deal with transmundane realities. In other words, given Berger's limited definition of the inductive approach, no one can actually determine the truth value of religious claims. Rather, all religious claims have equal value in the social sphere, provided that they point to something beyond this world. Naturally, this phenomenological bracketing may be useful for gathering information, but it does nothing for critically appraising the relative merits of any one religious vision. And yet, Berger subtly holds that his inductive methodology is somehow better than the deductive and reductive possibilities. But how can this be the case when Berger's own approach is shaped by culturally relative plausibility structures? The sociological knife of relativism cuts both ways. As Van A. Harvey so aptly points out, one is led to the conclusion that Berger's own attempts at theology are a reflection of this crisis rather than a cure for it, because his own theology itself has no norms or criteria that govern his statements. It simply is a reflection of his own personal sensibility. Apart from the fact that his interferences from certain alleged human propensities are philosophically porous to the extreme, how can one move from a sense of outrage at injustice to the affirmation that there must be damnation while at the same time relying on cultural relativism. The issue here, it seems important to say, is not Berger's appeal to faith in order to ground his assertions. It is, rather, that there are no norms or criteria that justify one type of faith rather than another. Berger is critical of Protestant liberalism's cognitive surrender to modernity, but he is himself committed to some limited accommodation to liberalism. But what is the principle that determines the limits of accommodation? On what grounds, for example, does he reject the notion of a decisive revelation in Christ, but retain the notion of the biblical God, especially since Christian theologians have traditionally used the appeal to Christ to ground basic affirmations about God? Thus, Berger seems vulnerable to the same shifting cultural winds, mood theology, of which he was so critical when it was practiced by the secular theologians. Everything hinges on his own personal sensibilities. A good illustration of the limits of Berger's inductive option can be seen in his section on religion, experience, tradition, reflection, in the Heretical Imperative, where he makes the distinction between other religious virtuosi and everyone else. For the religious virtuosi, mystical experiences are as immediately self-authenticating as the experience of a toothache. Therefore, most of their writings are not necessarily concerned with the reality of the divine encounter, except when they deal directly with skeptics, for example, Saint Teresa of Avila and her struggles with her confessors, see The Interior Castle. However, instead of making religious virtuosity the raison d'etre of his inductive methodology, Berger lessens the mystical quest for experiential certainty and opts for an approach which is at best based on faith, and at worst highly speculative. Berger even suggests that non-mystics have a certain advantage over the religious virtuosi, since they can with some detachment look for evidence in the accounts of those who claim to have had such an experience. In other words, they have the advantage of the dentist over his patient in any effort to undertake a comprehensive investigation of the phenomenon toothache. What Berger fails to consider, though, is that there is no evidence whatsoever in verbal written accounts of transpersonal states of consciousness, but only suggestive descriptions. Moreover, any dentist, to stay with Berger's analogy, who does not have an experiential feel for a toothache, runs the high risk of causing pain to his patients. It is simply not true that non-mystics have an advantage over the religious virtuosi in undertaking a comprehensive study of the transcendent. Berger might as well say that non-mathematicians have an advantage over mathematical geniuses when it comes to studying mathematics. By artificially separating the religious virtuosi from his inductive option, Berger castrates any chance for a truly comprehensive, experiential or otherwise, understanding of the transcendent in individual and social life. Criticizes McCann, if the privatizing trend is built into Berger's vision of the inductive option, then all the more reason there is for those who are disturbed by this trend to seek some sort of resolution of the dilemma posed by his view of religious experience. In either case, the intention will be to overcome the relativism that Berger seems left with by building a bridge between the religious virtuosi and the rest of us. Berger's most provocative chapter in the Heretical Imperative is Between Jerusalem and Benares, the Coming Contestation of Religions, wherein he posits two major forms of divine encounter: confrontation with the divine, epitomized in the West with the monotheistic tradition, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the interiority of the divine, exemplified in the East with such religions as Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and in some sects of Sikhism. Usually, these two forms of divine encounter are viewed as antagonistic to each other. The confrontational religions, where God is usually seen as ontological other, downplay the role of mysticism. Even a sophisticated Protestant theologian of the 20th century like Karl Barth was not averse to rejecting every form of mysticism as unbelief. On the other hand, Religions which stress interiority, particularly the yoga systems of Hinduism, have a tendency, albeit a more polite tendency than confrontational religions, to see monotheistic traditions at worst expressing a state of spiritual benightedness, at best being useful states toward a higher form of experience, in which they are destined to be dissolved. Berger, however, is confident that this present situation of contestation between the two forms of religion can be moved into a more fruitful dialogue if the inductive approach is utilized. The problem between the two camps is primarily one of interpretation. Elucidates Berger, from the standpoint of Jerusalem, the problem is formulated as follows. If God revealed himself in the Torah, or, of course, in Jesus Christ or in the Quran, how could he also be found within the interiority of mystical consciousness? From the standpoint of Benares, the inverse formulation pertains. If the divine is to be experienced as the true ground of every man's consciousness, what is the status of particular historical revelations? In order to rectify the apparently insoluble impasse between religions of confrontation and interiority, Berger suggests that each side must a priori give up their exclusive claims on divine knowledge. That is, each side must concede that all human religious experiences deserve serious study, and that it is possible for other religions to have genuine divine encounters. Following this course of action, the real question becomes, how could it be possible that both types of religious experience are true? Berger goes on to point out, though, that this very question has already been posed by several serious theologians and thinkers from both camps. The result? Not surprisingly, theologians from the confrontational school uphold the superiority, no matter how subtle, of theism. Witness the efforts of the Roman Catholic thinker R.C. Zehner. Whereas the mystical adherents stress the superiority of Advaita, non-dualism, and monism. See the arguments of Ninian Smart. Yet, does Berger's inductive option really resolve the contestation, metaphorically framed by him, between Jerusalem and Benares? The answer is that it does not, indeed cannot, because Berger limits his inductive methodology to the speculative realm. True, Bergerian induction does generate discussion and dialogue, which is undoubtedly fruitful, but by its own acknowledged limitations cannot provide any adjudicatory function relative to the truth values of any one religious vision, experience, or claim. Berger's inductive option is, quite simply, a method of phenomenology, wherein the sociologist rackets any causal questions in order to understand the described experience as is. Naturally, there is much in favor for a phenomenology of religious experiences, but it should be pointed out that Berger's inductive approach is not truly concerned with core experiences as such, since, as he states, the religious virtuosi are left out in this approach, but with the rest of us who have, at best, fugitive and imitational experiences of the mystical dimension. Put bluntly, Berger does not go far enough in his methodology, nor does he take the religious enterprise seriously enough. Indeed, if there really are transcendental realities beyond this world, and they are the heritage of all mankind, why not develop a meta-empirical approach? In other words, why not move religion out of the realm of fugitive experiences to actual experience? If natural science deserves and demands the same, why should we expect less from religion? Simply because it takes considerable effort to become a religious virtuoso does not mean that it should be shelved as a desired component of the inductive method. The same fallacious argument could be applied to quantum mechanics. Since it deals with an almost incomprehensible realm of empirical data, and only few physicists are experts in the area, theories about subatomic physics should be left to those who don't deal with the realm directly, and who have only fugitive, imitational relations with its study. But religious realities are by definition transempirical, so how can one study them directly? The answer is surprisingly simple: by employing the same methodologies advocated by the various religious traditions. Elaborates Ken Wilber, it is sometimes said that mystical knowledge is not real knowledge because it is not public knowledge, only private, and hence it is incapable of consensual validation. That is not quite correct, however, for the secret to consensual validation in all three realms, material, mental, spiritual, is the same, namely, a trained eye is a public eye, or it could not be trained in the first place, and a public eye is a communal or consensual eye. Mathematical knowledge is public knowledge to trained mathematicians, but not to non-mathematicians. Contemplative knowledge is public knowledge to all sages. Even though contemplative knowledge is ineffable, it is not private, it is a shared vision. The essence of Zen is a special transmission outside the scriptures, that is, between master and student, not dependent upon words and letters, the eye of mind. Seeing into one's nature with the eye of contemplation and becoming Buddha. It is direct seeing by the contemplative eye, and it can be transmitted from teacher to student because it is directly public to that eye. The knowledge of God is as public to the contemplative eye as is geometry to the mental eye and rainfall to the physical eye. And a trained contemplative eye can prove the existence of God with exactly the same certainty and the same public nature as the eye of flesh can prove the existence of rocks. A comprehensive transcendental paradigm, Berger's inductive option taken to its fullest, would draw freely on the eye of flesh and on the eye of reason. But it would also be grounded in the eye of contemplation. That eye embodies a valid mode of knowledge. It can be publicly shared. It can be communally validated. The inherent limitations of Berger's inductive method are such that theology will not resolve its internal conflicts in any way, except maybe to clarify them more accurately. As such, Berger's emphasis on speculative experience and their apparent equal worth value only moves theology in the direction of paradox. In other words, given Berger's typology, there cannot be a resolution between confrontational and mystical religions, only descriptive clarification of their desired aims. Moreover, I would add, that Berger's typology does not adequately do away with the deductive and reductive arguments posed for and against religions. In sum, Berger's inductive phenomenology lacks the necessary structuralism with which to ground his exploratory methodology. Although there is much to criticize about Berger's inductive option, it is not without merits. By emphasizing the experiential realm, albeit in a speculative fashion, Berger rightly moves the study of religion back to its own turf. Whatever the religious enterprise may become, the fact remains that religion arises from an experience of the sacred, be it confrontational, totaliter aliter, or interior, tat twam asi, I am that. Thus, to center sociological and theological analyses on the human experience of the sacred is both appropriate and useful. However, Bergerian induction can be greatly improved if it would expand its understanding of experience to include the following three components. 1. Direct empirical observation of religious realities, by which I mean the practical application of the methodologies prescribed and followed by the religious virtuosi. 2. Differentiation of the underlying structural elements behind religious experiences, visions, and claims. That is, an examination and clarification of the various structural, hierarchically organized or systematically conjoined contexts wherein religious experiences take place. And 3. The introduction of a normative religious science with which to appraise the relative truth value of mystical claims experiences, such as the one provided by Ken Wilber on legitimacy and authenticity in his book, A Sociable God. The first component suggested, direct empirical observation, extends Berger's inductive option from the merely theoretical, via fugitive experiences, to the transcendental. Instead of having the rest of us, the religiously mediocre, lead the forefront of inductive research, the burden should be placed on those who deserve it, the religious virtuosi. We demand the same in science, in fact all fields where competency is valued, so should we expect the same in religion. As Ken Wilber rightly illustrates, knowledge is not democratic, creativity is not egalitarian. I realize that sounds contrary, but consider, when we want original, concise, and brilliant insights in any field of knowledge, we almost always go to the acknowledged masters of that field. In physics, we look to Newton, then to Einstein, then Heisenberg. In biology, we go to Lamarck and Darwin and Wallace, then Morgan and Watson and Crick. In psychology, to Freud and Adler and Jung and James and Piaget. And why not? Genius is genius. Hence, to strap the inductive approach on those who are experientially not competent, for example most sociologists, is to invite nothing less than speculation and debate. If religion is truly an experiential domain, then utilize methodologies that explore that domain directly. The second component, structural differentiation, enables Bergerian induction to ground its phenomenological descriptions in proper contexts. Not all religious experiences are equal, or carry the same numinous weight. For instance, in the hierarchical structure of religious visions, I argued that there is a qualitative difference between religious visions, precisely because not all spiritual manifestations occur on the same structural level. Beholding a vision of Jesus during a dream is different than seeing him while awake or in a near-death experience. The difference here is not so much on the content as it is of context, since, in this case, there are various levels of consciousness, creating several contextual layers. The first step in any critical examination of religious visions is to perform a structural analysis so as to determine which level a particular manifestation is taking place. Likewise, almost all religious experiences can be better understood and described if there is a structural determination. Many so-called religious experiences or visions, for instance, may be nothing more than vivid images which manifest quite normally while one is dreaming. Simply because an image is of a holy or revered personage does not qualify it automatically as a transpersonal, e.g. genuinely mystical, manifestation. Thus, the proper adjudication of spiritual experiences lies not in the manifest content of the apparition, but in the context and structure wherein one beholds the sacred image. That is, on which level of consciousness is the vision seen? Is it a subconscious dream image, a psychic intuition, or a genuine encounter with a subtle plane deity? It is only after such a contextual structure determination that the critical phenomenologist can then proceed to analyze the content of the vision properly. The third component, a critical normative religious science, is designed to weigh the relative truth value claims of almost any religious experience. Berger wants his inductive approach to bring various disparate religious experiences in dialogue with each other. Yet he offers very little help in how differing religious claims can be appraised, except to say there is no finality to any experience of truth in history. Although this may be true, it does not come to terms with the fact that there are still differences in spiritual encounters. The inductive option as it stands is actually a phenomenological prelude, after which, Berger argues, it is the task of the theologian or philosopher of religion to find a normative measure that will transcend the merely historical comparison. The problem with Berger's notion of this normative measure, however, is that, according to him, it cannot be the direct result of empirical analysis. Why not? Berger avoids the issue again by dismissing the religious virtuosi as a minority, to be followed and taken seriously as forerunners in the inductive approach. Instead, Berger resorts to a questionable defensive mellowness as the hallmark of true religious liberality, inadvertently betraying his bias for mystical piety and tolerance, with the comment, "One could even suggest that those who have truly encountered the reality of the unseen can afford the mellowness of liberality both in their lives and in their thinking." One cannot help wondering about the mellowness of a Moses or a St. Paul. Did they afford themselves a liberality of thought? No, the normative measure of religious claims cannot adequately be left to speculative theologians who only have, admits Berger, a modicum of imitative experiences of the sacred. Rather, a critical religious science should be left, and open, to those who are the religious virtuosi. We do not allow, nor accept in our academic communities, judgments made by non-specialists on the latest findings in science or scholarship. We always look, as Wilber pointed out, to the acknowledged experts of the field. This does not mean to say that others do not have a say in appraising religious claims, but only that we ground our judgments in light of expert testimony. Perhaps one of the best normative measures developed concerning the critical appraisal of religious experiences claims comes from Ken Wilber, who has done extensive work on the hierarchical structure of consciousness. Wilber's argument is clear and succinct. Take religion out of the realm of faith and study its relative truth value claims by actually pursuing its described methodologies. Obviously, this entails making a major commitment to one's object of study. But don't we expect the same in any other field of endeavor, such as medicine, law, or even sports? On close scrutiny, it becomes clear that Berger's approach is not truly inductive at all, in the experiential sense, but is rather a liberal attitude toward religious phenomena in general. To move beyond Bergerian induction necessitates a willingness not only to take religious realities seriously, but to actually explore directly that realm. Berger's mistake is that he disdains the deductive and reductive options for not taking religion seriously enough, while at the same time postulating an inductive approach that turns the religious enterprise from a truly experiential encounter into a sophisticated debate over transcendental descriptions. To talk about the merits of painted cakes does not provide one with any true sense of what it is like to actually eat a real cake. Likewise, to argue about the ontological status of religious realities without actual experiential engagement is to misunderstand entirely mysticism's spirituality and the proper definition of induction. Postscript. I think the reason I am so harsh on Peter Berger's position, as outlined in the Heretical Imperative, is because it fails to take the mystic's position seriously enough. A surface reading of Berger suggests that he is, in fact, an advocate of mysticism, or personal religious experiences. But a closer reading indicates something else. It indicates, rather, that Berger is a liberal armchair speculator when it comes to religious experiences. Moreover, in a recent book, 1992, Berger even suggests that St. Paul was one of the greatest religious virtuosi of all times. Well, how does he know, especially given the fact that he has only skimmed the surface of mystical encounters? He writes as if he knows only because he has done what the mystics have generally argued against, reading versus experiencing the accounts of spiritual luminaries. St. Paul could be, as far as Berger knows, as deluded in his visions of the risen Christ as John Roger Hinkins is about seeing Savan Singh in 1963, some 15 years after the latter's death. Given Berger's approach to mystical matters, he cannot possibly know, because he is unwilling to do what any good scientist should: utilize the proffered technique and experiment repeatedly with it to discover the phenomenon face to face. Chapter 2. The Only Christian? The Alternative Message of Mary Magdalene. If I remember correctly, it was an early morning religion class with Father Costello, a Dominican priest, and it was an offhand remark he made, which I am not quite sure any of my classmates would still recall. However, it made a lasting impression on me. I was only 15 at the time, and a bit too inquisitive for my own good, especially given the strict orthodoxy of our teacher. I asked what I thought was a relatively pertinent question concerning the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Has there been any research done on trying to find Jesus' burial tomb? You know, the one that his disciple, Joseph of Arimathea, made out of stone? Father Costello animatedly responded that it didn't really matter, since Jesus' remains were not there. I then interjected, but what about the possibility of his bones still being there? This set Father Costello off, and he excitedly muted my skepticism with, "No, they will never find his bones, because that would mean that Jesus didn't resurrect, and that all of Christianity is a lie. If that were to be the case, I would rip off my Dominican robes and party like a hedonist." Father Costello's unexpected rejoinder struck me and a few of my friends as quite odd, since it looked as if he really did want to party, but couldn't do such given his a priori conviction in Jesus' bodily ascension. It was at this juncture that I probably should have shut my mouth, but being a precarious teenager, I had a tendency to push hot-button issues, especially if it related to religion. So I quipped, "You don't really love Jesus, but rather a glorified image of him." Oops, I went too far. I got kicked out of the class and got yet another detention, which was Notre Dame High School's way of punishing you by staying after school in a classroom with other truants and staring at the clock for another 30 minutes. This incident has stayed with me for all these years because much of Christianity, especially in Roman Catholic and evangelical forms of the faith, is centered precisely on the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. Doubt that such a thing transpired, and for many Christian churches, you end up living an eternity with Satan and his comrades in horns. But something seemed amiss to me, especially after I did a close reading of the New Testament and comparing the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are, for Christians worldwide, the essential narratives in which the resurrection of Jesus Christ is delineated. One must take any account of Jesus and his ministry with a large particle of intellectual salt, since no known writings of Jesus exist, nor anything dating from his lifetime. While there are a few scattered non-Christian sources about Jesus' life and teachings, ranging from Josephus to Tacitus, the bulk of what we think we know about him comes from decidedly Christian-converted sources. Whether these are reliable guides, of course, is still open to serious debate. Thankfully, we now have access to one of the earliest versions of the New Testament in Greek, Codex Sinaiticus, which is online and available for close inspection, especially for the illustrative display of the many corrections made on the text itself. See www.codex-sinaiticus.net/en/. But even this most primordial of texts is at least 3 centuries removed from the central character it describes. The variances in the 4 Gospels concerning the resurrection of Jesus Christ are so apparent that one doesn't have to have any special training to immediately notice them. Indeed, whenever the issue of Jesus' resurrection comes up in my science and religion course at California State University, Long Beach, I simply have my students take out a piece of paper and draw 4 columns on it, and we proceed to systematically compare and contrast the 4 gospel accounts. Invariably, most of my students are startled by what they uncover, since many have never consciously read the Gospels in such a horizontal fashion. Evidence that doesn't demand a verdict. The 4 Gospels. The first thing we notice is that after Jesus' death, one of his personal disciples, Joseph of Arimathea, requests the dead body of Jesus from Pilate, so that he may lay it in a new tomb which he had hewn out of rock. But, in the Gospel of Matthew, we learn the chief priests and Pharisees, who had opposed Jesus' ministry, argued to Pilate that they feared his disciples would simply steal his dead body and claim that he was resurrected. For that reason, they requested that the grave be secured for 3 days and guards placed to protect it. In that same gospel, we learn that 2 women, Mary of Magdalene and the other Mary, visit the tomb on the 3rd day after Jesus' crucifixion to take care of his body. In the other 3 Gospels, the number of women who show up on that day changes. Mark has 3 women, Mary of Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. In Luke, he has at least 4 women who appear, Mary of Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the rest of the women with them. The Gospel of John only has 1 woman, Mary of Magdalene, and she is the only woman to show up in all 4 Gospel accounts. In Matthew, after a great earthquake, an angel of the Lord descends and rolls away the stone. In Mark, there are no earthquake and no angel descending, but the women, though worried about how to move the stone, realize after looking up that the stone has already been rolled away. In Luke, the women find the stone rolled away without any explanation, and in John, Mary notices that the stone had been taken away. There are other variances as well, perhaps the most contradictory one being that in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, there are 2 differing versions on how the women reacted when discovering the empty tomb. In the Gospel of Matthew, the 2 women, after learning of Jesus' resurrection, are overcome with great joy and reported the good news to the other disciples. However, in the Gospel of Mark, the 3 women, after learning from a young man inside the tomb that Jesus has been raised, and who are directly instructed to tell all of the disciples, particularly Peter, about the news, don't do so. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. In Luke, however, when the apostles are told of Jesus' resurrection, they do not believe and call it nonsense. In Mark, we find a similar response when Mary Magdalene tells the disciples of Jesus' appearance to her, which they did not accept. There are still other discrepancies as posted on www.religionfacts.com. Yet the most unusual yet deeply revealing passage occurs in the Gospel of John, where Mary of Magdalene, after informing John and Peter that the tomb was empty, finds herself back at the empty tomb, wondering where his body has been moved. It is very clear that she doesn't think that he is resurrected, but rather that somebody or some group has moved his body somewhere else. She even pleads with a gardener near the tomb to provide her with instructions about what happened to Jesus' body. It turns out, however, that there is no gardener at all. It was Jesus she was talking to, but didn't recognize him. As John retells it, "But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping?' She said to them, 'They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him.' When she had said this, she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was him. Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?' Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, 'Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away.' Jesus said to her, 'Mary.' She turned and said to him in Hebrew, 'Rabboni,' which means teacher. I personally think the preceding is the most beautiful passage in the entire New Testament because it reveals something that is oftentimes neglected in most Christian churches. Mary of Magdalene doesn't believe that Jesus has resurrected, even after she personally sees that the tomb is empty. She just wants to tend to his dead human body. I have read these passages innumerable times, and several years ago something stood out that I hadn't really thought about before. Not only did Jesus' disciples not expect him to resurrect from the dead, They were downright skeptical when they first heard reports from their fellow disciples that he had indeed emerged from the dead. This is odd on the surface of it, since we are repeatedly told that Jesus had prophesied such a thing, and even his detractors believed that the disciples would deceptively fake his resurrection. In Matthew, we learn that the Pharisees and chief priests thought that the disciples would steal Jesus' body from the tomb and say to the people, "He has been raised from the dead." One could easily infer from this consensus that Jesus didn't make such a belief in his bodily resurrection a requirement to follow him when he was alive, since none of his disciples, including his most devoted, seemed to think such a thing would occur, even after some witnessed an empty tomb. Or, if he did indeed teach such a thing, apparently he had some very slow learners among his disciples, as not one of them seems to have taken it seriously. But all of this is secondary to a much more important point that I think gets at the very heart of the matter. Mary of Magdalene went to the empty tomb to take care of Jesus because she didn't care if such a body resurrected or not. She loved Jesus himself, regardless of whether he turned out divine or human. We see this quite poignantly in her query to the gardener, where, in her tears, she pleads, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Putting aside the strange fact that Mary mistook Jesus for a gardener, was he trimming the hedges around the tomb? The unmistakable impression we are left with is a bereft woman whose number one concern is to take care of the crucified body of her deceased teacher. In sum, she loves Jesus regardless of whether he resurrects or not. Today, when I ask Christians if they love Jesus Christ, they immediately respond with an immediate yes. However, when I ask them if they would still love Jesus if he didn't resurrect, almost all of them, with the same immediacy, say no. At this stage, I then raise up the issue about what we think love means and what it implies. So I give them an example designed to touch their emotional selves. Imagine a boyfriend who says that he loves you only if you are absolutely perfect. You must always look stunningly beautiful, always provide a ready smile, and never, not even once, succumb to a changed mood. In other words, if you are always 100% perfect, your boyfriend will love you. If, however, you deviate even slightly from that ideal, your boyfriend will dump you. All right, let's imagine the opposite type of boyfriend. This man loves you despite any obstacle you may put in his way. You may be insecure, unattractive, unbalanced, or fill in the blanks, and he stays with you through good and bad times, no matter what may arise. If, given a choice between these two obviously extreme examples, which person do you think truly loves? So let's put this in much sharper relief. The earliest Christian account that we have concerning Jesus' resurrection reveals that his closest disciples did not think he was going to resurrect from the dead. Yet, at least one of Jesus' very closest followers, Mary Magdalene, demonstrated by her actions that she loved Jesus, even if such an event never transpired. Apparently, the requirements to be a Christian when Jesus was alive, or even a few days after his death, didn't include an absolute belief in his bodily resurrection. Yet, according to some forms of biblical fundamentalism today, if we freeze frame the moment when Mary sees the empty tomb and thinks Jesus' body was moved or even stolen, and she died right at that moment as an unbeliever in the risen Jesus, she would, given certain strict Orthodox interpretations of that cornerstone event, go to hell for eternity. Indeed, in some biblical circles, if you confess that you love Jesus only as a human being, and don't believe in the most central of all miracles of the faith, that Jesus conquered death, you are not a Christian at all, and thus are relegated, Dante's Inferno notwithstanding, a secure place in eternal damnation. Now, to my eyes, this type of theological spin, which, lest we forget, only occurs after Jesus is long gone, seems utterly absurd. In fact, one could argue that nobody today loves Jesus at all, but rather an idealized image of him that is literally created out of words spoken and written by followers of him 20 to 60 years after his death, and even then in a language that Jesus most likely never spoke. Just taking the New Testament as our guide, we might be surprised by how little we actually know about Jesus. Quite frankly, we probably know more about our next-door neighbor than we do about Jesus. The following checklist will underline this point. Do we know in what year Jesus was born? No. Do we know what month Jesus was born? No. Do we know what day Jesus was born? No. Do we know what town Jesus was born in, Bethlehem or Nazareth? Do we know who Jesus' father was, God or Joseph or... Do we know how tall Jesus was? No. Do we know how Jesus looked? No. Do we know if Jesus had brothers and sisters? Catholics say no, Protestants say yes. Do we know exactly what Jesus did between ages of 3 and 11? No. Do we know exactly what Jesus did between the ages of 14 and 26? No. The list goes on. While I understand that for many Christians, answers to such details may seem inconsequential, I do think it is ironic that if we went back in time, we would be unable to pick Jesus out of a mug lineup, which of course begs the question of how one can be sure that one's vision of Jesus in this or the afterlife is really indeed Jesus. Yet the most vital question of them all still remains. What is it that we love? One could argue that there are no Christians today in the Mary Magdalene mold, because her love, bizarre as it may sound, would be regarded as complete heresy in most of the Christian churches in the world. Why? Because she loved Jesus no matter what. Can any Christian today honestly say the same? Perhaps there should be a revival of this most ancient form of Christianity that seems to have been lost over the ages, which is to reflect on what Mary Magdalene demonstrated so movingly on the third day after her master's death. Despite all the circumstances and all the invectives that were cast upon Mary, she went to the tomb of her teacher to tend to his dead body because she, unlike the millions of Christians today, loved Jesus unconditionally. When I think back on Father Costello's heated reaction on what he would do if Jesus' bones were found, quit the order and party, and compare it with what Mary Magdalene did after she discovered the empty tomb, weep and try to find out where his body had been moved, it makes me pause and wonder, at least in a metaphorical vein, was Mary Magdalene the only Christian? Note: eventually, this questioning attitude of mine got me into more serious hot water, and by the end of my junior year, I was summarily dismissed from the school, with the words, "You are not a Notre Dame man," which, coming directly from the vice principal, turned out to have an ironic twist, since he himself eventually left the Brotherhood and declared his homosexuality and started a new line of work as a plumber in Van Nuys, where he moved in with his boyfriend. I should add, as a further side note, that several years later I found myself teaching religious studies in the same department with Father Costello at a Catholic high school. This time, however, we were both teaching sex education, but in different classrooms and with apparently different agendas. One section of the book was too risque for him, so he had 30 pages of the required text stapled together, so that the students wouldn't be able to read such scandalous materials. Of course, when I was told about it, we immediately read those sections aloud in class. Such were my heretical ways. Chapter 3. Clash of the Archetypes. Mummy versus the Wolfman. The primary repression in human beings, according to Ernest Becker, is not sex, as Freud would have us believe, but death. Culture, therefore, is what man does with his fear of impending thanatos. If such is the context of the human dilemma, the most significant question that arises is not how we repress death, but what is it that we are trying to avoid? The mummy in pursuit of immortality. Around 2000 BC, it was quite clear to man what death was. It was the annihilation of the physical body. Thus, in flight from such a fate, we find Egyptian immortality projects that attempted to preserve the corporeal frame. This process was known as mummification, and its great archetype, known to monster fans around the world, was the mummy. What man tried to do was avoid individual extinction by keeping intact that thing which he believed housed life, the body. The obvious problem in such a solution is that it simply did not work. But even though these first crude attempts for bodily preservation via mummification and the mummy did not work, mankind's immortality project did not cease. Ever since man began to develop a strong self-sense, according to Julian Jaynes from about 3000 BC, with the advent of farming and language, which he connected with his psycho-physical vesture, he has tried to exploit in various ways the vehicle of his separate existence. This same overriding tendency has survived to our present day. What we find in modern society, particularly in the West, is the drive to eventually master the physical body. That is, make it an instrument for optimum survival. Thus, in current DNA research, there are hopes for a breakthrough in molecular engineering that will help to understand and eventually control the aging process, thereby prolonging the duration of life in the human body. By the turn of this century, we are told, medicine will have advanced far enough so that people will be able to live well over 100 years. And beyond that horizon, years into the future, science envisions that we may have immortal bodies, the equivalent of immortal life. However, the word immortality is a misnomer, because, quite frankly, no matter what we may do with the physical body, it is in itself not immortal. We may be able to maintain it for 15,000 years, or even extend its functions to 1,000,000+ years, but, as astrophysics quite clearly points out, in a few billion years, the whole known universe will do either of two things: continually expand outwardly, resulting in an entropic situation where matter and energy reach a state of inertia, or the cosmos will collapse in on itself, taking every single life form back to an infinitesimally small point, so that all life as we know it, including our immortal bodies, will be extinguished. Whatever the final outcome of the universe, one thing is for sure. The final score will read Thanatos 1, Eros, life via the body, 0. The Wolfman, in quest of extinction. Not everyone in history, however, has felt that the extermination of the physical body meant absolute death. Rather, some saw it as a transition of consciousness from one field of manifestation to another. We find this idea predominant in the Upanishadic period of India and exquisitely drawn out years later in Tibet in the Bardo Todal, more popularly known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Interestingly enough, we find in this text not a flight from death, but rather a preparation for it. What Tibetan Buddhist philosophy desires is unconditional death. Hence, even the ascension of the soul to higher regions of awareness is regarded as samsara, more maya and illusion. All visions, all temporary heavens, even individual selves as such, are seen to be the root cause of suffering. What haunts and torments man is not a frightening and wrathful thanatos, but not enough thanatos, an incomplete annihilation, so to say. Nirvana, the extinguishing of the flame, as Buddhists put it, is real death. and that is precisely what the devout Lama yearns for. A classic example of this quest for extinction is found in the motion picture version of The Wolfman. What this half-human, half-beast wants is to no longer be subject to the cycles of life, a revolution that for him reaches a terrible, bloodlusting peak every full moon. What the Wolfman desires is Thanatos. But, in the movie script, the Wolfman can only die if he is shot with a silver bullet. His death wish does not come in all avenues, but only one very elusive form. This quest for extinction, as exemplified in the Wolfman, came about in the history of mankind exactly at the time that the fear of death arose, with the advent of the self. Today, the yearning for oblivion has taken on several expressions, ranging from extreme asceticism to the possibility of a nuclear global war. However, can man experience absolute death? Can he enjoy total extermination? Surprisingly, the answer is no. Just as the Egyptian priest could not preserve the physical body indefinitely, neither can the Tibetan monk experience complete extinction. The reason why the monk cannot is both simple and profound. Non-existence, by definition, does not exist. To experience absolute death is entirely impossible, because experience belongs to the category of consciousness and existence. No one can observe total annihilation, plainly because real death encompasses the observer, leaving neither the seer nor the seen. Non-being cannot be enjoyed, because there is no one left to enjoy it. Thus, in this scenario, man's search for extinction falls short. Neither can he preserve the body forever, nor can he experience absolute death. This is the human dilemma, and this is where we find ourselves. The paradox of death. The body is not immortal, and non-existence does not exist. It is really an amazing thing, but most of us do not really examine death as it is. We have stories about it, myths surrounding it, and taboos guarding it, but we do not investigate death in its naked essence. For when we truly understand what death implies, we are confronted with a great paradox, a classic if confusing koan. The human dilemma, succinctly put, is that man as a separate self cannot live forever in the physical body, but neither can he experience absolute non-existence. Thus, it is as if we were caught in a cosmic catch-22, or at least, so it seems. What is the lesson to be learned from this clash of the archetypes, this paradox of the mummy and the wolfman? Only two things: acceptance and transcendence. Acceptance, because although we are timelessly alive, our existence is within a form, and transcendence, because that very form does not last eternally. Therefore, man's spiritual journey is not one of extreme withdrawal towards a final exit, nor a massive attempt for bodily survival. On the contrary, it is to accept life, being, and existence as it is. And, in order to do that, man has to both accept his self and, at the same time, transcend it. In the end, Thanatos does not conquer Eros. The wolf-man does not defeat the mummy, or vice versa. Instead, Thanatos and Eros meet, for immortality and annihilation are two aspects of the same reality, the same whole. Their separation is man's dilemma, their union is man's enlightenment. Recommended reading: The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, 1974. Eternal Life by Hans Kung, 1984. Die to Live by Charan Singh, 1979. Heading Toward Omega by Kenneth Ring, 1985. Easy Death by Dafri John, 1983. Death and Dying, The Tibetan Tradition, 1986. Radiance Without an Edge. Try this test. See if you can experientially remember when you were not. That is, go back in time, memory, and see if you can recollect the moment when you came from unconsciousness to consciousness, from non-existence into existence, from non-being to being. Frustrated? Cannot remember? Well, you are in very good company, since nobody can ever recall such a moment of evolutionary genesis. The fact of the matter is that it is impossible to remember the birth of your consciousness. What is most telling about this little exercise, however, is that you can also never experience the death of your consciousness. It is literally out of the realm of experience. Hence, what we should fear about death is not the extinction of being, but the awareness of moving from one level of consciousness to another. It is life, not death, which is really quite scary. Strange as it may seem, we are witnesses to an eternal play of consciousness. We arise, we sleep, we dream, we die. But in the midst of it all, we continue to persist. Indeed, there is only persistence, no matter what circumstance may arise. Just like the assumed characters of our dreams, we wage intense battles only to find that the arena we felt so certain was real was, in truth, an illusory, dependent structure, ready at any moment to disappear in a flash known as waking up. This world is no different than a dreaming stage. The only apparent difference, mystics point out, is that it appears to be of a longer duration. So the only constant in this peculiar process is that we continue to manifest in different regions of awareness. When we physically die, nothing will change, except that we will reappear in a new drama, a new field of interplay. But the essential mystery of life will not change. We will still be ignorant, dumbfounded, and in awe. We can pretend or pose otherwise to one another, acting as if we have an inside clue to the secret of God, truth. But when the new death comes, every state of awareness has its own terminal apex. All our posturing will be exposed for naught. We may live forever, but it is not you or me which is doing the living. We are simply witnesses to a stream of being, which has no beginning, no middle, and no end. Radiance without an edge. Chapter 4. Why Karma Theory is Nonsense. If everything is painted blue, then saying one thing is blue is meaningless, since it doesn't stand apart from anything else. Color is defined by its variations. Likewise, any moral system that posits a one-size-fits-all explanation is pointless, since morality, like color, is defined by its differences. Back in my graduate days at UCSD, I broke my ankle playing in a pickup game of basketball. Using my injury as a prompt, later on that week, I got into a philosophical conversation with two of my friends about why such mishaps occur. In other words, why does the world have to be such a place where all sorts of bad things happen, from Ebola viruses to lightning strikes to cosmic collisions with meteorites? My Christian friend, well versed in the Bible, explained that it was all due to the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where they disobeyed God and ate from the tree of knowledge. This is the original sin, he went on, and because of this, all of nature is cursed, and thus the imperfection of life itself. However, God, out of his infinite love and mercy, sent his only Son, Jesus, to remedy the situation, by offering his own life as a sacrificial lamb, to save the lot of humankind, provided that they repented of their wicked ways and accepted him as their personal Lord and Savior. My friend wanted to continue, but we knew his preaching would never end, so I jokingly interjected, "You mean to suggest that Adam and Eve are ultimately responsible for my broken ankle?" To which he matter-of-fact retorted, "Yes." At this point, my other friend, names have been withheld to protect the innocent, shouted out his disagreement. "No, bro, Dave broke his ankle because of karma. the moral law of action and reaction. He must have done something bad previously, either in this life or the ones he lived before, and now he is paying the price. He kidded me, given my strict vegetarianism, and laughed, saying that maybe I ate some tandoori chicken in my previous incarnation in India, and now I was getting my just retribution. Both of these explanations I had heard many times before, and I found them unsatisfactory. However, on the surface, karma theory seemed to be more viable than the notion that original sin was instrumental to the current operating system of the universe. Though the fact that both original sin and operating system have the same initials, OS, does make me pause, if only to smile at the coincidence. But the more I looked into the concept of karma, the more nonsensical it appeared. Karma is perhaps the least understood concept in Eastern mysticism. One often hears spiritual seekers refer to a particular event, usually something tragic, as, "That's his or her karma." On the surface of it, such statements look innocent enough, especially when saints and sages from India have spoken, since time immemorial, of a person's fate in terms of the inexorable law of karma, the moral equivalent of Newton's law of cause and effect, action and reaction, etc. However, there is a very curious problem in the haphazard use of the word karma that is for the most part glossed over or neglected. Even if we accept the idea of karma and its apparent universal applicability, we can never truly discern any one thing as not karmic, since the implication in Eastern philosophy and mysticism is that everything is karmically bound. Thus, karma as a concept cannot in any singular case be utilized as an explanation of some event, some action, and some retribution. Or, if we do dare to use it as such, we are more or less speaking gibberish. A crude example may illustrate this better for us. Let's say that a person gets infected with influenza. We learn about it later, and with our newfound vocabulary, we immediately say something like, "Well, that's karma." Yet, if we are to be consistent in our understanding, we must also say that everything preceding the event of getting sick is also karmic. Even our statement to the effect that "that's karma" is itself karmic. What do we have here? It's really quite simple. We have an all or nothing proposition that has absolutely no discerning force in explaining anything that can occur. We might as well say that everything is caused by "I don't know." Because in a strange twist of phrase, if everything is karmic, for simplicity's sake, say everything is significant or has meaning, then nothing in particular is karmic, or is significant or has meaning, since all karma is interconnected. In other words, if everything is significant, then nothing individually is significant. That is, nothing stands apart from anything else. Nothing has peculiar or distinctive meaning. We are caught in an intractable web, and any time we try to isolate one event from another and pontificate on its titular importance, we lose a vital chain in its ultimate interdependence. Thus, when we say something is karmic, we are, unconsciously no doubt, and not with any evil intention, of course, acting like we know something profound, and we are saying something brilliant. We are doing neither. We are simply illustrating how genuinely confused we are over the immensity of the concept. Because to truly understand karma is to realize that we cannot, at any stage, distinguish one event from another, and then extrapolate and pass judgment on that one ferreted out sequence. More simply, if karma is indeed karma, it is inextricably intertwined with an almost infinite matrix of other sequences, none of which can be divorced from each other. What is quite intriguing about all of this is that if we truly understand that everything has meaning, everything is distinguished, let's say again, in exchange, then we could just as easily say that nothing, read no thing with an emphasis on the no and emphasis on the space between no and thing, has meaning or nothing has significance. No thing, in other words, is karmic. Which leads us to this. If no thing has meaning, then we could just as easily say that all events are the result of chance. And by chance, I mean that we cannot properly adjudicate any one event and give it a truly causal basis. Rather, we could only give it a probable explanation, not dissimilar to quantum mechanics and Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty. Though I don't want to, at this stage, commit the fallacy that all things are collapsed to the same dimensional level of explanation. Let me punchline this. We are probably much more honest when we say to the person who wants an ontological moral explanation to why he/she, and not somebody else, broke their ankle or got a flu, that we really don't know why such and such happened ultimately. All we know, in terms of moral ontology, is that certain phenomenal events occur which lead us to such and such a conclusion. But instead of simply stating our ignorance, or our limited point of view, or our basic statistical correlations, we instead say something completely inane. We say something like, it's karma, as if we have just revealed our brilliance. We have, of course, revealed nothing of the sort. We have revealed our benightedness. As we should know by now, nobody knows what karma ultimately is. Why? Because it is an endless circle. All actions are interconnected, which leads to the previous action, which leads to its previous action, which ultimately leads to the original initial action, which leads to the causal basis of being, or matter, or I really don't ultimately know what, which ends up where we started, not knowing. Thus, it may be that materialists are being more polite and perhaps a bit more accurate, and surely a lot less arrogant, when they say that randomness, even if that chaos has some ultimate predictable order, or chance, is at the bottom or top of the universe. Randomness or chance, at least, has the linguistic advantage of conveying upon its listener the sense of unknowingness. All of this points to the fact that we use the concept of karma like a political weapon to justify what we don't understand, or, in some cases, to jockey for some perceived status of deep insight among a sea of naive humans. We act like we know something when we truly do not. Much better, I suspect, to say that we really don't know much. Perhaps the best explanation I heard for why I broke my ankle, besides the obvious one, you need to learn how to not trip when going in for a layup, came from my surfer friend, who also happens to be a medical doctor. He looked straight in my eyes and said, "Your question is a no-brainer." I then prodded him further to explain what he meant, and he said, "Dave, shit happens. Deal with it." Chapter 5. Quantum Theory and the Transcendent. I wrote the following article 30 years ago. It was published in Fate magazine, where I had written a number of articles and book reviews in order to help pay for graduate school at the University of California, San Diego, where I was pursuing my PhD in the sociology of knowledge. At that time, I was asked to review a number of works on the paranormal, and I received a large assortment of books, ranging from astrology to near-death experiences. Later in that same decade, the 1980s, I was asked to teach a graduate course on parapsychology at the University of Humanistic Studies in San Diego, later to be located in Del Mar, California. This was a heady time, since many books had come out trying to connect quantum theory with ancient mysticism. A number of them were bestsellers, including Michael Talbot's breezy Mysticism and New Physics and his 1991 The Holographic Universe. Side note, Michael Talbot died at the young age of 38 in 1992. Quantum fever spread through the New Age community in the late 1970s, primarily because of Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics and Gary Zukav's The Dancing Wu-Li Masters. There was such a bonanza of books and magazine articles discussing the quantum connection to mysticism, that the editor of the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology commented as early as 1983 that the field was already overly saturated. When Ken Wilber entered the fray in the late 1970s and 1980s, he came in as a breath of fresh air and as a voice of mature reasoning. He also doused the overly heated proceedings with skeptical coolness, pointing out that most of the correlations were either trivial or inaccurate. Ken Wilber was just emerging as a well-known author. He had penned The Spectrum of Consciousness, No Boundary, The Atman Project, and Up from Eden around this time, and I found his skeptical voice on this subject to be spot on. He seemed to be the only grown-up in the party, and he was basically saying the quantum holographic mystic connection was mostly hype without substance. I have always felt that Ken Wilber was at his best when he wrote as a skeptic, particularly when applying his considerable wit to all things New Age. He was tremendously insightful, even if one found him disagreeable, in such books as The Holographic Paradigm, Quantum Questions, Eye to Eye, and A Sociable God, all written within 3 or so years of each other. As I have previously mentioned, I first met Ken Wilber in 1983 at the annual Transpersonal Psychology Conference held in Monterey. It was an accidental meeting, since he bumped into us asking for directions to a particular meeting hall. We began a friendly association for a number of years, and I have used his books in a large number of my courses, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. It was in this context, as an appreciative reader of all things Wilber, that I wrote the following article for Fate magazine, mid-1980s. What I find perhaps most interesting, however, is how the latest breakthroughs in quantum theory have blurred the dividing line between the micro and macro worlds. It is no longer possible to categorically state, as I mistakenly did in the following piece, that quantum mechanics only applies to the subatomic, since even the very food we eat is dependent upon quantum mechanical interactions. See the film I made at the end, entitled On the Quantum Mechanical Effects on Photosynthesis. Most surprising, at least for me, is how interest in the quantum mystical connection has exponentially evolved and not died out as a topic of interest. Indeed, there are now whole conferences devoted to understanding how consciousness may be the result of tiny quantum interactions. See Roger Penrose's series of books and articles on this subject, including The Emperor's New Mind. We now have a cottage industry of books devoted to this subject, and I see no downturn in the near future. It appears our day-to-day lives are indeed impacted by the quantum world, where even our sense of smell, so rudimentary to almost all animals, is the result of quantum interactions for which we remain completely unaware. Even the idea of the universe being a hologram, something Pribram proposed almost in jest nearly 40 years ago, has garnered support from even the most cynical of physicists. For a good primer on the latest developments in quantum theory and its elemental place in our existence, I highly recommend reading Michael Brooks' 2015 book, At the Edge of Uncertainty, along with Brian Greene's and Sean Carroll's numerous books on physics. New Physics and Ancient Mysticism, circa mid-1980s. Who is right in this quantum debate, the physicist with mystical leanings, or the physicist with materialistic purviews? Although science and religion have been divorced from each other for several centuries, in more recent years there's been a major push for a reunion. This remarriage is being proposed by a number of important scientists and thinkers, including physicist Fritjof Capra, neuropsychologist Carl Pribram, and brain-mind editor Marilyn Ferguson. They believe that the findings of new physics substantiate ancient mysticism. Indeed, several books that espouse this dynamic idea have become bestsellers: The Tao of Physics, the Dancing Wu-Li Masters, and the Aquarian conspiracy. Do the new physics and ancient mysticism, seemingly opposite disciplines, intersect? Yes, according to Michael Talbot, author of Mysticism and the New Physics, who argues that the discoveries of quantum mechanics after the turn of the last century point to the non-objective nature of the world. In other words, what mystics have been saying all along, that there is no separation between the observer and the observed, is proved by theoretical physics. No, argues John Wheeler, well-known physicist at the University of Texas, who brands the attempts to unify mysticism with physics as moonshine, pathological science, and charlatanism. Moreover, he states, "In the quantum theory of observation, my own present field of endeavor, I find honest work almost overwhelmed by the buzz, absolutely crazy ideas being put forth with the aim of establishing a link to a quantum mechanics and parapsychology. Who is right in this quantum debate? The physicist with mystical leanings, or the physicist with materialistic purviews? Surprisingly, the answer is neither. For the quantum debate is essentially an illegitimate argument, contends Ken Wilber, noted transpersonal therapist who is both a practicing mystic, Zen Buddhism, and a distinguished scientist in psychology and biochemistry. Wilber comments, modern physics neither proves nor disapproves, neither supports nor refutes a mystical spiritual worldview. There are certain similarities between the worldview of the new physics and of mysticism, but the similarities, where they are not purely accidental, are trivial when compared with the vast found differences between them. To attempt to bolster a spiritual worldview with data from physics, old or new, is simply to misunderstand entirely the nature and function of each. As Einstein himself put it, the present fashion of applying the axioms of physical science to human life is not only entirely a mistake, but also has something reprehensible in it. Wilber asserts that, although several of the world's great physicists may have embraced mysticism in their private lives, almost none of them have felt that their discoveries in science substantiated religion. Rather, each domain has its own method and domain of observation. Physics, matter. Biology, life processes. Psychology, mind. Religion, spirit. And, as such, the findings of one field can ad hoc be applied to another, such as equating psychology with biology, etc. Though there are similarities to be found and connections to be made when appropriate, the differences are so vast that each discipline must be kept separate, so the effectiveness of its own method of study will not be diluted. For example, it would be absurd and non-productive for a physicist to examine molecules using the principles of psychoanalysis. Likewise, it is equally inane to explore human motivations and meanings solely in terms of kinesiology, the principles of mechanics and anatomy in relation to human movement. This simple hierarchy of knowledge has been overlooked by many of the writers on the union of mysticism and new physics. When Michael Talbot writes that consciousness and the material universe are linked by some fundamental physical mechanism, for instance, he thinks he's doing a great service to mysticism. In fact, he's actually contradicting the insights of mystics, who contend that it is spirit, not matter, that unifies consciousness with the universe. This pernicious reductionism, the tendency to explain complex events by their simpler components, is actually worse for mysticism's cause than the damage done by more materialistic scientists who have ignored the subject. This is because, whereas physicists have refused to explain the insights of mystics in purely mathematical terms, Talbot and his peers elaborate upon a simplified theory, often erroneously using the discoveries of the physics and neuropsychology. A good illustration of this type of mistake is found in the misapplication of Erwin Schrödinger's famous cat thought experiment. On the subatomic level, particles act in ways much queerer than we expect, or in some ways than we can even understand. The interaction of infinitesimally small bits of matter is literally a world all of its own, complete with special quirks and rules. To better help lay persons understand this strange universe of the quantum, physicist Erwin Schrödinger developed a thought experiment which is now known infamously as Schrödinger's cat. Imagine that a cat is put into a glass box. Poisonous gas, which has a 50% chance of being released and killing the animal, is also enclosed. The odds in this case are determined by a random event, the radioactive decay of a particle. After an hour or so, you come back to learn the result. Is the cat dead or alive? Now, on our level of reality and that of classical or Newtonian physics, we would find the animal either living or dead, but never both at the same time. Yet, according to some quantum theories, the cat, which in this case represents a wave function on the subatomic level, is both alive and dead at the same time. That is, particles may have an existence contrary to our normal perceptions. They may move in two directions at the same instant. They may be in two places at the same time without traversing space, and so forth. Here is a veritable twilight zone of time-space warps. The problem, however, with Schrödinger's cat is that as a thought experiment, it applies only to the subatomic level. Talbot and other New Age writers want to apply the quantum discovery to our everyday lives, as if this special reference has practical implications for existence. Hence, when John Wheeler talks about his many worlds interpretation of quantum waves, each function splitting off into a real, albeit incomprehensible universe, Talbot seizes upon it as proof for mysticism's claims that there are higher states of consciousness, forgetting in the process that Wheeler's theory and Schrödinger's are meant to apply only to the subatomic domain. Such nefarious extractions do not buttress mystical insights, but only convolute them. Another example of how the latest findings in science are misused to support a mystical outlook is found in the much-touted holographic paradigm, which attempts to explain such diverse mental phenomena as long-term memory and ESP. Carl Pribram, distinguished neurosurgeon psychologist at Stanford University, believes that our brain operates very much like a hologram, which is a three-dimensional image created by recording the interference wave-like patterns around a given object. A good example of the lifelike qualities of a hologram is shown in the scene in the movie Star Wars, where the captured princess sends a message through her trusted robot companion in the form of a holograph. The unique aspect of a hologram is that in each part, a miniature replication of the whole is contained. Unlike a photographic plate, which splits up into several distinct pieces when broken, a hologram cannot be divided without each separate unit containing all the information of the whole. Our central nervous system, according to Pribram, is great at processing filters which mathematically construct reality out of a timeless and spaceless frequency domain. Pribram elaborates, it isn't that the world of appearances is wrong. It isn't that there aren't objects out there on one level of reality. It is that if you penetrate through and look at the universe through a non-lens system, in this case a holographic system, you arrive at a different view, a different reality. And that other reality can explain things that hitherto remain inexplicable scientifically, such as paranormal phenomena. In terms of holographic theory, all those events, such as ESP and out-of-body experiences, are plausible if the brain can somehow abrogate its ordinary constraints in getting access to the implicate order, frequency domain. It is mind-boggling. In the frequency domain, time and space become collapsed. In a sense, everything is happening all at once, synchronously. Naturally, consequences are extensive. If Pribram is correct, every object we behold, from the neighbor next door to Mount Everest is a vision projected within the confines of the brain. Outside our neurological chambers, these images as such do not exist. In a sense, we are seeing our own central nervous system and its responses to exterior stimuli, not the world as is. Pribram goes one step further in his holographic analysis and poses the question, could it be that the universe itself is a hologram? If so, as parts of the indivisible hologram, do we have access to the whole itself, God, absolute reality? Marilyn Ferguson comments, he, Pribram, suggested that transcendental experiences, mystical states, may allow us occasional direct access to that realm. Certainly, subjective reports from such states often sound like descriptions of quantum reality. Bypassing our normal constricting perceptual modes, what Huxley called the reducing valve, we may be attuned to the source or matrix of reality. Finally, we have a scientific theory which supports mystical visions. The holographic reality looks to be almost identical to the Buddhist concept of enlightenment. Ferguson states further, and perhaps the most extraordinary ancient description of a holographic reality is in a Buddhist sutra. In the heaven of Indra, there is said to be a network of pearls, so arranged that if you look at one, you see all the others reflected in it. In the same way, each object in the world is not merely itself, but involves every other object, and in fact is every other object. But does the holographic paradigm really substantiate mysticism? Again, according to Wilber, the answer is no. In point of fact, it offers no proofs whatever. Rather, the paradigm indicates that the brain may have different ways of storing memory, a holographic system being just one of them. As for Pribram's frequency zone, where space and time become collapsed, it does not necessarily refer to the transcendent state described by mystics. Though the language is similar, no time, no space, the former is concerned with memory storage, the latter with spiritual insight. As Wilber puts it, how one could jump from a blur of one's own memory to crystal consciousness that transcends mind, body, self, and world is not made clear at all. It is a wild theoretical leap to move from personal memory is holographically stored to therefore all lines are part of a transpersonal hologram. Thus, a tragic flaw in trying to prove mysticism with scientific findings is that we end up discounting the testimony of the mystics themselves, who categorically state that the path to God is not through reasoning, logic, mathematics, or any device of the verbal mind. It is through spiritual practice, meditation, prayer, and loving devotion. The result in such haphazard endeavors is an oversimplification of transcendental phenomena, best grasped not by rational speculation, but by intensive spiritual discipline. As Wilber points out, the danger is in the false belief that all one has to do to become a mystic is to study quantum mechanics or neurophysiology. Similarly, there's the mistaken notion that anyone who studies subatomic matter is automatically a mystic. The explanations for the strange paradoxes in the new physics and neuropsychology, like Schrödinger's cat and Pribram's holographic paradigm, do not automatically apply to the macro world of our day-to-day lives. Just as we wouldn't equate our domestic troubles with the interactions of excited electrons, we shouldn't try to compare the unique properties of quantum waves with the mental potentials of mankind. Wilber says, Planck's view, if I may summarize it, was that science and religion deal with two different dimensions of existence, between which, he believed, there can properly be neither conflict nor accord, any more than we can say, for instance, that botany and music are in conflict or accord. The attempts to set them at odds on the one, or reunify them on the other hand, are founded on a misunderstanding, or more precisely, on a confusion of the images of religion with scientific statements. Needless to say, the result makes no sense at all. Interestingly, the one area mystics and strict empirical scientists agree is in their mutual refusal to unify science and religion. Perhaps Jeremy Bernstein, particle physicist, says it best when he writes, "If I were an Eastern mystic, the last thing in the world I would want would be a reconciliation with modern science, because to hitch a religious philosophy to a contemporary science is a sure route to its obsolescence." Wilbur adds, "Genuine mysticism, precisely to the extent that it is genuine, is perfectly capable of offering its own defense, its own evidence, its own claims, and its own proofs." Religion and science, contrary to what most people believe, were divorced for very good reasons. They were never compatible. Hence, not only was their reunion ill-advised, but also it has postponed for centuries the mature development of their respective talents. To insist now on a remarriage, because their progenies in physics and Eastern mysticism bear a striking resemblance to each other, betrays the essential fact that they arise from an entirely different set of principles and assumptions. It is better for us to appreciate that fact, that science and religion do not belong together, and not forge crucibles that in the end cause more harm than good.